I did not flinch when my mother's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade designed specifically for me. I did not let my shoulders collapse inward. I simply watched her mouth move around that word, waitress, as though it were the final, irrefutable proof of my irrelevance. And I noticed, with the clinical precision of someone who had been studying her tells for 43 years, the exact moment her confidence shifted into something brittle and performative. The mahogany paneling of Superior Court absorbed the fluorescent light in that particular way that makes everyone look slightly diseased, and my mother looked worse than most. She wore a cream-colored suit that cost more than 3 months of my restaurant salary, her hair arranged in the kind of precise blonde that requires biweekly maintenance and a specific type of shame about aging. Your Honor, she continued, turning slightly toward the bench with the practiced grace of someone who had testified before, probably in her divorce from my father, probably in the custody hearing she'd won by convincing the judge that I was better off with him, probably in whatever financial proceeding had necessitated that cream-colored armor in the first place. She is simply not equipped. She has never held a position of any real responsibility. This is a travesty of justice. The judge's expression did something I would later understand as the initial involuntary response of a man who had just been handed an exceptionally easy moral decision. He did not need to read my grandfather's psychiatric evaluations. He did not need to review the 7 separate handwritten letters my grandfather had left, each one naming me explicitly, each one explaining with the kind of precision that only a retired engineer can muster why my mother could not be trusted with the $11 million that represented 40 years of his professional life. He simply needed to believe that the woman in the cream-colored suit was correct about my incompetence. And the courtroom, filled with family members I had not spoken to in 6 years, filled with lawyers my mother had hired with money that was not yet hers, filled with strangers who had never seen me do anything except stand silently in my server's uniform, with my dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it gave me headaches by the end of my shift. The courtroom laughed. The sound of it was not surprising. It was familiar in the way that a recurring illness becomes familiar, something your body recognizes and braces for before the pain arrives. I stood in the back of that courtroom, wearing the exact uniform I wore at Marchetti's, the Italian restaurant in Pasadena, where I had maintained perfect composure through 4 years of customers who snapped their fingers like I was a trained animal, through managers who corrected my pronunciation of gnocchi, through nights when the dinner service ran until 1 in the morning, and I still drove myself to the law library at UCLA to study evidence and civil procedure. The uniform was deliberate. It was a costume I had chosen 4 years ago when my mother had made some comment about my pretensions at a family dinner I should never have attended, and I had decided in that moment, quietly, with no announcement, with no dramatic pronouncement, that she would never see any evidence of who I actually was until the moment it would destroy her most completely. My name is Catherine Voss, and I am currently 39 years old, though in that courtroom I still carried the posture of someone who had been made to feel perpetually younger, perpetually less than, perpetually in need of an explanation for simply existing in proximity to my mother's ambitions. If you have ever sat in a room where your own blood relatives treated you like an inconvenient stranger, like a biological accident that nobody had bothered to correct before it was too late, then you understand the specific weight of that moment. If you have ever been dismissed by someone whose opinion should have mattered least, but somehow came to matter most, if you have ever watched a family member weaponize their disappointment in you, like a precision instrument designed specifically for your particular vulnerabilities, then you already know that what happened next in that courtroom was not about justice. And it was not about an $11 million estate. And it was definitely not about whether I was qualified to manage wealth. It was about something far more primal, the catastrophic moment when the person who taught you to doubt yourself suddenly becomes aware that her doubt was never warranted in the first place. If this story resonates with you, if you have your own kitchen table memories of being underestimated by the exact people who should have believed in you first, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because what comes next in part 2 is the moment when every single one of those years of strategic invisibility paid dividends that my mother's lawyers never anticipated. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. The dysfunction did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated like dust in the spaces between family gatherings, like sediment in water that looks clear until you hold it up to the light. My father had left when I was 12 years old, and the circumstances of his departure had been made sufficiently humiliating that I internalized his absence as a personal failure, a belief my mother neither corrected nor discouraged. She had custody. She had remarried twice in the 7 years following the divorce, and each time she had presented the new husband as a profound improvement on the previous model, as though I was expected to view each marriage like a software update, each one categorically better than the last. The second husband, whose name was Mitchell Corbett, lasted 4 years and left me with a specific memory of standing in our kitchen in Lowe's Angels while he told my mother that she was poisoning me with her constant criticism. And then he left, and my mother spent the next 3 months insisting that his departure proved something about my character, something about the way I had treated him, something about my fundamental inability to foster healthy relationships. By the time I was 19, I had learned to exist in my mother's presence with a kind of controlled dissociation. I spoke in shorter sentences. I did not mention my academic accomplishments. I did not tell her about the partial scholarship I had received to UCLA, and I certainly did not tell her about the additional partial scholarship to cover living expenses, because I knew from experience that good news presented to her was inevitably reframed as evidence of some character defect or socially problematic behavior on my part. When I was admitted to law school at 23, I told her 3 weeks after I had already committed to attending, and I presented it as something that had just happened, something I had sort of fallen into. Language designed to minimize the 4 years of deliberate academic work, the $1,500 bar exam preparation course I had paid for with money from the restaurant, the practice tests I had completed at 3 in the morning in my apartment. Sitting at a kitchen table made of black laminate that wobbled if you leaned on the left side too heavily. My grandfather, my mother's father, Harrison Voss, was the one person in our family architecture who had never participated in the project of making me smaller. He was a civil engineer who had spent 42 years designing infrastructure projects, first in California and then in 3 other states. And he approached life with the kind of methodical precision that made him seem almost robotic to people who did not understand that precision is often an expression of deep care. He would visit me at Marchetti's without announcing himself, would sit in a corner booth, and would watch me work with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was studying a system of remarkable complexity. After one particular dinner service in which I had managed 8 tables simultaneously while 2 servers had called in sick, he had waited until I finished my shift and then asked me to sit across from him in the parking lot in his car, which was a sensible gray Volvo that he had maintained with religious consistency. He had said, "Catherine, I have watched you for 3 hours manage the logistics of that restaurant as though you were conducting a symphony. Why does your mother not see you?" And I had not answered him, because the answer would have required me to explain that my mother did not actually want to see me, that seeing me clearly would have interfered with her carefully constructed narrative of my inadequacy, and that sometimes families operate as closed systems of mythology that have nothing to do with objective reality. My grandfather died on a Thursday in February, 19 months before that courtroom scene. He left his estate to me directly. The will was 14 pages long, and it was witnessed by 2 attorneys and a certified public accountant. It was airtight. It was also a declaration of faith so absolute that my mother responded to the reading of it with a kind of controlled fury that manifested as a lawsuit filed exactly 93 days after his funeral. But that is not where the story actually begins. The story begins 6 months earlier, when I discovered that my mother had attempted to access his financial accounts using information she should not have possessed, using passwords that could only have been obtained through unauthorized means, through a specific violation of trust that had required her to either steal those credentials from his home office or convince him to provide them under false pretenses. I discovered this not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through a series of bank statements that my grandfather had, in his methodical way, forwarded to me marked for your review. Statements that showed 3 unauthorized attempts to access a money market account containing $837,000, exactly the amount my grandfather had designated for my law school debt and living expenses. I did not call my mother. I did not call my aunts. I did not call the family lawyer. Instead, I opened a document on my computer, a simple Word file with a white background and black text, and I began to catalog every anomaly, every unauthorized access, every financial discrepancy that appeared in the statements my grandfather was forwarding to me with increasing frequency. I created a spreadsheet. I organized it chronologically. I did not print it, I did not share it. I simply kept it in a password protected folder on my encrypted laptop, accessible only to me, growing larger week by week as new evidence accumulated. At the time I was sitting in that courtroom, watching my mother dismantle my reputation in 14 seconds, I had documented 173 separate incidents of financial misconduct, unauthorized access, document manipulation, and systematic fraud perpetrated by my mother against my grandfather's estate. And I had also documented, with the kind of precision that would make an accountant weep with gratitude, every single dollar that had been misappropriated, diverted, hidden, or transferred into accounts that bore names I had initially not recognized, but had eventually traced back to shell companies my mother had established in 2019, 2021, and 2022. The cream colored suit my mother wore to court came from a boutique in Beverly Hills called Saks Fifth Avenue, and the price tag, which I had later photographed from the receipt she left on her dining room table during a house call I made to retrieve some of my grandfather's personal effects, was $4,215. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not let my hands shake or my voice waver. I simply noticed everything, cataloged everything, and waited for the precise moment when all of that accumulated evidence would transform from a private collection of damning documentation into the most comprehensive legal argument for prosecutorial fraud that Superior Court had witnessed in 5 years. That moment was going to arrive in exactly 6 weeks, and my mother had no idea that she had just voluntarily provided me with one more piece of evidence. The testimony itself, recorded officially, transcribed permanently, admissible as a statement against interest. I was going to destroy her so completely that she would spend the remaining years of her life wondering how she had ever miscalculated so fundamentally. The country club was exactly the kind of place designed to make people like me feel as though we were attending on provisional status, as though our membership cards were printed on paper slightly thinner than everyone else's, as though we could be asked to leave at any moment without explanation or recourse. The Pasadena Country Club had been established in 1906, which meant it had been excluding people systematically for 120 years, which meant the exclusion was no longer even acknowledged. It had simply calcified into the architecture, into the dress code, into the specific way the staff seemed to recognize members and non-members through some kind of osmotic social intuition that did not require explicit instruction. My mother had been a member since her marriage to Mitchell Corbett in 2008, and she had maintained the membership through both subsequent divorces, which suggested that she valued the social positioning more than she valued most functional relationships. I arrived at 6:45 in the evening on a Friday in May, exactly 2 weeks after the courtroom scene with my mother's cream-colored suit and her carefully weaponized dismissal. The occasion was the executor's dinner, a gathering of family members ostensibly convened to discuss the distribution of my grandfather's personal effects, the furniture, the art, the jewelry, the house in Santa Barbara that was worth approximately $3,200,000. My mother had suggested the venue. My mother had also suggested the time. My mother had written the guest list. What my mother did not know was that every single family member she had invited had been contacted individually by my attorney, Richard Chen, a man in his 62 years who had spent 37 years prosecuting fraud cases for the state of California before going private, and who had advised each of them, very gently, that the estate was currently undergoing a comprehensive financial audit, and that any discrepancies they discovered between the official will and the actual distributed assets would be reported to the authorities within 30 days. None of them had believed it was serious until they received the certified letter. Then they had all called my mother, which was exactly what I wanted them to do. I wore a navy blazer, not the same navy as the one from the visual guidance I had planned for myself years earlier, but a deliberate echo of it, tailored by a woman named Sandra Okonkwo at a small shop in Los Feliz, over a white blouse with pearl buttons, each one approximately 7 millimeters in diameter, real pearl, purchased from a vintage jewelry dealer on Melrose for $140 approximately 3 months ago. The blazer cost $920. The blouse cost $215. I had purchased them both with money earned through billable hours, calculated at $300 per hour, which meant I was wearing approximately 4.5 hours of my labor. I had done the mathematics specifically so that I would know, with absolute precision, that every garment on my body represented a kind of value that my mother's rhetoric had insisted was impossible for me to generate. My aunts, there were three of them, sisters to my mother, women who had spent 40 years reinforcing her mythology of my inadequacy, were already seated at the table when I arrived. The table itself was circular, covered in a cream-colored linen tablecloth, set with silverware that had been polished to the point of reflecting light like mirrors. My Aunt Patricia, the oldest, wore a dress that appeared to be champagne-colored silk, accessorized with a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light every time she raised her wine glass. My Aunt Melissa wore charcoal gray with a strand of pearls that looked like they had cost more than my car. My Aunt Jennifer, the youngest, wore black with a pattern of small white flowers, and she was the one who always smiled at me with an expression that suggested she was performing sympathy while actually experiencing profound contempt. My mother arrived at 6:58, and she was carrying the energy of someone who believed herself to be in command of the narrative, someone who had carefully orchestrated this dinner as a kind of victory lap, a gathering of allies designed to reinforce the predetermined conclusion that I was unprepared, unsuitable, and ultimately irrelevant to the management of our grandfather's legacy. She wore another expensive suit, this one in navy blue, and she wore it with the kind of physical confidence that only comes from never having been told, in any meaningful way, that your body or your choices were anything less than completely acceptable. The dinner began with appetizers. Nobody addressed me directly until the main course arrived, a precisely portioned piece of halibut, artfully arranged with microgreens, and a lemon beurre blanc that the country club probably spent $40 on ingredients to produce. Then my Aunt Patricia set down her fork and said, "Catherine, we wanted to discuss your plans for the estate. The house in Santa Barbara, obviously, needs to be sold immediately. The market is soft right now, but we think," and she paused, and she looked at my mother, and my mother looked back, and some kind of silent communication passed between them that suggested they had choreographed this moment in advance. "We think you should allow a professional to handle the sale," my Aunt Melissa continued, her voice smooth in the way that voices become smooth when they are delivering a message that the speaker has rehearsed. "Someone from the family, ideally, someone with experience. Your mother has already begun conversations with an estate liquidation specialist." I did not interrupt. I did not argue. I simply cut another piece of halibut and placed it in my mouth, and chewed it with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested I was processing information rather than experiencing emotion. "The thing is," my Aunt Jennifer said, and her voice had that particular quality of false concern that I had been hearing my entire life, the tone of voice a person uses when they are about to say something cruel while maintaining the public posture of kindness. "We are all just a little bit worried that you are in over your head. No offense, but managing an $11 million estate is not the same as managing a restaurant, is it? It requires certain kinds of expertise, certain kinds of educational background, which I clearly lack," I said quietly, and I set down my fork and I looked directly at my mother. "Isn't that right? I'm just a waitress?" The words hung in the air for approximately 3 seconds. Then my mother laughed, not a full laugh, but something more controlled, something designed to suggest that what was about to happen was inevitable rather than hostile. "Catherine," she said, and her voice had taken on the particular tone of voice a person uses when they are about to deliver a punchline they have practiced. "Your Honor," she repeated, with exaggerated formality, and all three of my aunts smiled, and I understood that they had rehearsed this moment. They had planned to replicate the courtroom humiliation in this intimate setting. They were going to use the exact same language, the exact same dismissal, but this time without a judge to witness it. Without an official record, without the protection of legal proceedings, just family, just the four of them, coordinating to reinforce my mother's authority over my perception of my own worth. "Your Honor," my mother continued, and she was clearly delighted by her own cleverness. "She is just a waitress. How could someone with her background possibly understand the complexities of estate management? This is precisely why we need to take control, why we need to ensure that our father's legacy is managed by someone who has actual professional credentials, actual business acumen, actual." I did not flinch. I did not allow my jaw to tighten or my breathing to accelerate. I simply reached down and picked up my water glass, a Riedel Venom glass, worth approximately $35, containing purified water that the country club had charged them $3 per bottle to provide, and I took a sip, and I set it back down on the table with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested I was conducting a clinical experiment on my own emotional responses. "I understand," I said quietly. That you are all operating under a set of assumptions about my qualifications that were accurate approximately 4 years ago, when I was indeed working exclusively as a restaurant server. I understand that you have not been provided with updated information about my educational progress, my professional credentials, or my current employment status, because I deliberately withheld that information from all of you. I understand that you are now attempting to manufacture a precedent in which you take control of the estate based on that outdated information, and I understand that you believe you will succeed because you have successfully controlled narratives about me for 43 years. My Aunt Patricia set down her wine glass. My Aunt Melissa stopped chewing. My Aunt Jennifer's expression shifted into something that resembled concern, but was actually fear. What I need you to understand, I continued, is that I am an attorney licensed to practice in the state of California. I have been practicing law for 3 years. I am a junior partner at Morrison and Clark, one of the largest estate management firms in Los Angeles. My annual salary is $180,000. I have managed 17 separate estate distributions, totaling approximately $200 million in assets. I have passed every continuing legal education requirement for the past 3 years. And I have, for reasons that I will not explain to you at this moment, maintained absolute secrecy about these facts while working as a server at Marchetti's, and I have done this deliberately, strategically, and with complete knowledge of how that information would eventually be deployed. The halibut on the table had begun to cool. The microgreens were starting to wilt. The lemon beurre blanc was separating imperceptibly, oil beginning to break away from emulsion. My mother's face had undergone a transformation that was almost fascinating to observe. The blood had not drained from it, because that was a cliché and also physiologically inaccurate. Instead, her skin had taken on a quality of overcorrection, a kind of flushed, desperate brightness that suggested her body was processing adrenaline in response to catastrophic threat assessment. Her mouth had opened slightly. Her hands had stopped moving. She was experiencing, in real time, the specific horror of understanding that every calculation she had made, every assumption she had weaponized, every dismissal she had deployed, had been predicated on information that was not just incomplete but deliberately falsified by the person she had been attempting to destroy. How long have you known about this? She asked, and her voice had changed, had become something smaller, something without its previous architectural certainty. I did not answer her directly. Instead, I turned to my Aunt Patricia and said, "You will be receiving a certified letter from the estate auditors by tomorrow evening. That letter will explain that the distribution of my grandfather's personal effects cannot proceed until a comprehensive financial audit has been completed. That audit will take approximately 4 to 6 weeks. During that period, all family members will be required to cooperate with the investigation. Some of you may be required to provide documentation about your financial transactions and your interactions with our grandfather's accounts during the 2 years preceding his death." I stood up from the table. I placed my napkin on my chair. I looked at my mother directly, and I allowed myself to register, with scientific precision, the exact moment when her face transformed from certainty into the beginning stages of understanding that she had just been catastrophically outmaneuvered by someone she had spent 4 decades training herself not to see. "I will be in touch," I said, "through my attorney, Richard Chen, regarding the distribution schedule. I suggest you all consider the advantages of cooperation." I walked out of the Pasadena Country Club at 7:32 in the evening, and I sat in my car, a 2019 Honda Civic purchased used, financed through the credit union at a rate of 3.9%, and I called Richard Chen, and I said, "They have just confirmed in front of 3 witnesses that they received advance notice of the audit and that they are proceeding regardless. Can you activate the fraud referral with the district attorney's office?" Richard's voice on the phone was calm in the way that a person's voice becomes calm when they are about to watch years of preparation transform into legal vindication. "I will send the certified package tomorrow morning," he said. "And Catherine, your mother just gave us everything we needed. She confirmed knowledge of the investigation and proceeded to attempt intimidation anyway. That is consciousness of guilt. That is evidence of obstruction. That is going to make the prosecutor's case almost embarrassingly straightforward." I ended the call and I sat in the parking lot of the Pasadena Country Club, and I allowed myself to smile. Not a smile of triumph, not yet, but a smile of recognition. The smile of someone who understands that the trap has been set perfectly, that the family has just walked directly into it while celebrating what they believe to be a victory, and that the next phase of this particular narrative would be measured not in weeks or months, but in years of legal proceedings. Regulatory investigations, and the systematic dismantling of every financial structure my mother had spent the past 4 decades constructing. My mother had no idea that every conversation at that dinner table had been recorded, that every statement she had made was being simultaneously transcribed by the digital recording device I had placed in my blazer pocket, a Sony ICD-PX 470, purchased for $129, small enough to fit in a closed fist, sophisticated enough to capture audio at professional quality, and that her attempt to humiliate me in front of my aunts had just provided the prosecution with the kind of evidence that made juries weep with the satisfaction of watching calculated cruelty receive its exact appropriate response. Richard Chen arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday evening in early June, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived 3 decades of courtroom battles, carrying the physical weight of documentation that had transformed from abstract suspicion into irrefutable legal fact. My apartment was small, 940 square feet, in a building in Los Feliz that had been constructed in 1972, with original hardwood floors that creaked in specific locations and walls that were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the plaster if the volume exceeded a certain threshold. I had decorated it with the kind of minimalist precision that comes from having very little money and a profound aversion to clutter. One couch, one coffee table, one bookshelf containing legal texts, case studies, and 3 novels I had read so many times the spines had begun to separate from the binding. This was the space where I had studied for the bar examination at 3 in the morning, where I had created the initial documentation files on my laptop, where I had lived in complete compartmentalization for 4 years, while the rest of my family constructed increasingly elaborate lies about my capacities and my worth. Richard set the briefcase on my coffee table and opened it with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested what was inside required a specific kind of mental preparation to process. Inside were 17 separate manila folders, each one stamped with case numbers and dates, each one containing documents that had required forensic accountants to extract, financial investigators to analyze, and lawyers to interpret into the kind of language that would be comprehensible to a prosecutor who had never met my family and therefore possessed no emotional investment in protecting their reputation. Richard pulled out the first folder and laid it flat on my coffee table, and the first document was a bank statement from a money market account that my grandfather had established in 1998, a document that showed 214 separate unauthorized withdrawals executed over a period of 19 months, each withdrawal ranging from $5,000 to $87,000, totaling, when summed completely, approximately $4,321,000. These withdrawals, Richard said, and his voice had taken on the particular tone of someone delivering news that he had rehearsed but still found difficult to articulate, were executed using your grandfather's credentials, but they were not authorized by your grandfather. The bank's security protocols recorded the IP addresses from which each withdrawal was initiated. Every single one of them came from the same location, your mother's home office in Pacific Palisades. The bank also has security camera footage from the times these withdrawals were made. Your grandfather was in a skilled nursing facility in Glendale during the entire period these withdrawals occurred. He could not have physically made any of them. I did not speak. I simply looked at the document, at the precise accounting of theft, at the specific itemization of betrayal that had been meticulously recorded by financial institutions that existed for exactly this purpose: to track money, to record movement, to provide the kind of undeniable evidence that made lies impossible to maintain. There is more, Richard continued, and he pulled out a second folder, this one containing documents that appeared to be loan agreements, each one bearing my grandfather's signature, each one dated within 6 months of his death, each one for amounts that ranged from $50,000 to $230,000. Your mother executed 9 separate personal loans against your grandfather's home equity line of credit. The documents show your grandfather's signature, but forensic handwriting analysis indicates that 7 of the 9 signatures were forged. The 2 that may have been legitimate were executed when your grandfather was undergoing chemotherapy and was taking narcotic pain medication at levels that would have compromised his cognitive capacity to make major financial decisions. We have his medical records confirming the dosages and the dates. He pulled out a third folder. This one contained documents related to a revocable living trust that my grandfather had established in 1995. A trust that contained specific language limiting the distribution of funds to direct descendants only, language that explicitly prevented my mother from accessing the principal without documented approval from at least two independent trustees. According to these documents, my mother had amended the trust without authorization, had changed the language to give herself unlimited access to the funds, and had forged the signatures of both independent trustees. The amendments were notarized, Richard explained, by a notary public who works in your mother's accountant's office. That notary has confirmed that she was never asked to notarize these documents, that she has no record of your mother appearing at her office on the dates the amendments were supposedly notarized, and that the notary seal on these documents is a photocopy of her legitimate seal, not an original impression. This is forgery. This is identity theft. This is systematic fraud perpetrated over a period of 4 years, executed with sophisticated understanding of financial systems, and documented with the kind of precision that makes prosecution essentially inevitable. I pulled out my laptop, and I opened the spreadsheet I had been maintaining since my grandfather first forwarded me those initial bank statements. The spreadsheet that contained 173 separate incidents, organized chronologically, cross referenced with dates, amounts, and the specific nature of each violation. Richard looked at the spreadsheet and he smiled, not a smile of satisfaction, but a smile of professional recognition. The smile of someone who understands that they have been partnered with a person who possesses not just intelligence, but also the kind of methodical patience that separates competent people from exceptional ones. This is extraordinary work, he said quietly. Do you understand what you have constructed here? I understand, I said, that my mother committed approximately 173 separate acts of financial fraud, identity theft, forgery, and embezzlement totaling somewhere between $9 and $12 million, depending on how the interest calculations are handled. I understand that she did this systematically, deliberately, and with clear knowledge that what she was doing was illegal. I understand that she did this while my grandfather was still alive, while he was becoming increasingly incapacitated by his illness, while he was in a position where he could not defend himself against her theft. And I understand that she did all of this while maintaining the public posture that I was the family member who was incompetent and unsuitable to be trusted with financial responsibility. The district attorney's office is going to want to move very quickly, Richard said. Once we provide them with this documentation, they will move to secure all of your mother's financial records, all of her digital communications, all of her devices. They will likely pursue charges within 30 days. Your mother will be arrested. She will be arraigned. She will face between 10 and 20 years of prison time, depending on how the charges are structured and how cooperative she is with the investigation. I closed my laptop. I stood up and I walked to the window of my apartment, and I looked out at Los Feliz Boulevard, at the people walking past my building, at the specific ordinariness of the world continuing to exist while my family was about to experience the catastrophic transformation from subtle criminality to public legal prosecution. When? I asked. We file next Monday, Richard said. That gives us 6 days to prepare the submission to the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor will likely present it to the grand jury within 2 weeks. If they decide to indict, and they will, the evidence is overwhelming, then your mother will be arrested within 48 hours of the indictment. Over the next 3 days, my mother and my aunts reached out to me with increasing frequency, each communication designed to perform a specific kind of psychological manipulation that suggested they believed I had accepted my defeat and was now available to be negotiated with. My Aunt Patricia sent me a text message on Wednesday morning. Your mother is concerned about you. She would like to have coffee. Please let us know your availability. I did not respond. My Aunt Melissa called on Wednesday evening and left a voicemail in which she explained that the family had decided to allow me to maintain my role as executor if I would simply agree to have my decisions reviewed by my mother before any distributions were made. I did not return the call. My Aunt Jennifer showed up at Marchetti's on Thursday evening, where I was working my regular shift, and she approached me while I was carrying appetizers to table 7, and she said, Catherine, we have decided to let this go. We have decided to accept the will as written. Your mother just wants you to know that she is proud of you, even if she doesn't always show it. I did not cry. I did not allow my hands to shake or my voice to waver. I simply thanked her and I continued with my shift, and I documented the interaction with the exact time and date and the specific words she had used, and I added that documentation to the file I was maintaining for the prosecution. On Friday evening, my mother herself called. Her voice had taken on a quality of false warmth that was almost painful to listen to, that suggested she was performing some kind of reconciliation narrative that she had constructed and was now attempting to deploy. "Catherine," she said, "I have been thinking about our conversation at the country club, and I realize that I was harsh with you. I realize that I did not take your accomplishments seriously enough, and I would like to apologize. I would like to take you to dinner, just the two of us, and I would like to have the opportunity to hear about your life, about your work, about all of the things I have missed over these past 4 years." I did not refuse the invitation. Instead, I accepted it. I said, "That would be lovely, Mother. I would enjoy that very much." And I scheduled the dinner for the following Thursday, and I documented the phone call with a recording application, and I added her voice to the file that was growing larger every single day. Saturday morning, I spent 6 hours with Richard Chen in his office in downtown Los Angeles, in a building that had been constructed in 1984 and had the kind of institutional, impersonal aesthetic that suggested the primary function of the space was documentation and legal procedure rather than comfort or aesthetics. We organized the evidence into 17 separate sections, each one corresponding to a specific category of crime. There were forged documents in one section, their signature variations documented with forensic highlighting, the inconsistencies marked in yellow so that even a person without handwriting expertise could observe the clear differences between my grandfather's signature and the signatures that had been executed on these documents. There were bank statements in another section, the unauthorized withdrawals highlighted in blue, the dates and amounts and IP address logs organized chronologically to demonstrate the pattern and frequency of the theft. There were loan agreements with the corresponding medical records proving my grandfather's incapacity at the time the documents were supposedly executed. There were emails, obtained through discovery protocols that Richard had initiated, in which my mother had discussed with her accountant the optimal way to access my grandfather's funds without triggering suspicious activity reports. I touched the documents with the kind of careful precision that suggested I was handling material that was irreplaceable, that was precious precisely because of what it represented, not triumph, not victory, but simply the restoration of accurate narrative, the reassertion of truth into a space where lies had been permitted to calcify into institutional fact. Richard had organized each section in manila folders that were stamped with official case numbers, and he had created a master index that cross-referenced each document to the specific charge it supported, the specific statute it violated, the specific penalty it carried. "Your mother does not understand," Richard said quietly, while we were organizing the final folder, "that you have been conducting a prosecution case for 4 years. You have been doing the work of a forensic accountant, a financial investigator, and a lawyer, all simultaneously, all in silence, all without any recognition or acknowledgement from anyone in your family. You have been building a case that would typically take a team of 8 professionals approximately 18 months to construct, and you have done it alone, in secret, while simultaneously earning a law degree and passing the bar examination and becoming a junior partner at one of the largest estate management firms in Los Angeles. I understand," I said, "that my family created a monster by attempting to minimize me, by teaching me that invisibility was the safest strategy, by demonstrating that honesty would be weaponized against me, and by showing me, over and over again, that the only way to survive in their system was to appear smaller than I actually was. They created the exact conditions under which I would develop the capacity to maintain absolute secrecy, absolute discipline, and absolute documentation of their crimes. They created me specifically, in the way that all families create the people who will eventually become their undoing. The evidence files were stored in a locked cabinet in Richard's office, behind a combination that only Richard and I possessed. The digital files were stored on encrypted servers with passwords that changed every 72 hours. By Saturday evening, approximately $9 million worth of documented fraud, 17 separate filing charges, and the comprehensive architectural blueprint of my mother's systematic criminality had been reduced to a form that was simultaneously portable and absolutely secure. On Sunday, my mother sent me flowers, white roses, 48 of them, arranged in a glass vase, with a card that read, "To new beginnings. I look forward to our dinner and to finally getting to know my daughter." The flowers cost $195, according to the florist's receipt that fell out of the arrangement. The message cost her nothing, because it was a performance, a public gesture designed to establish a narrative of maternal reconciliation that she was about to discover was significantly too late to execute. The district attorney's office received the comprehensive case file on Monday morning at 8:37 in the morning, delivered by courier, accompanied by a cover letter from Richard Chen that outlined the specific nature of the charges, the comprehensive evidence supporting each charge, and his professional opinion that the prosecution of this case would serve the interests of justice, would deter future white-collar crime, and would provide a substantial vindication of the victim's estate. My mother had no idea, as she selected a restaurant for our Thursday dinner, as she began to construct the narrative of reconciliation that she wanted to present to me, that the district attorney's office was already assigning prosecutors to her case, that forensic accountants were already beginning their systematic review of her financial records, and that approximately 48 hours after she walked into that restaurant and tried to convince me that she was capable of genuine maternal affection, she would receive a call from her criminal defense attorney informing her that the grand jury had voted unanimously to indict her on 17 separate felony charges, and that she would be arrested within the week. The restaurant my mother had selected was Campanile, which occupied a restored 1929 Italian Renaissance Revival building in Los Angeles, which meant it was exactly the kind of establishment designed to communicate culinary sophistication and financial status to anyone observing from the outside. I arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening on Thursday, and I sat in my car for approximately 4 minutes before walking inside. And during those 4 minutes, I confirmed that the recording device in my blazer pocket was functioning properly, that the USB drive containing the complete case file was secured in my jacket's interior pocket, and that my attorney Richard Chen was positioned in the lobby of the building next door with a direct line to the district attorney's office and the Los Angeles Police Department. My mother was already seated at the table when I arrived, positioned near a window that overlooked the street, wearing a dress in a soft cream color that suggested she had spent considerable time selecting an outfit that would communicate both sophistication and maternal warmth. She stood when she saw me, and she moved toward me with her arms slightly extended, and I allowed her to embrace me. And I did not move my arms, and I simply stood in her embrace in the way that a person stands when they are being held by someone they no longer have any emotional relationship with. Catherine, she said, and her voice had taken on a quality of manufactured tenderness that was almost nauseating in its transparency. I am so glad you are here. I have been thinking about our last conversation, about the things I said to you at the country club, and I realized that I was wrong. I realized that I have been wrong about you for a very long time. We sat down at the table. A server appeared almost immediately and placed water glasses in front of us, and my mother ordered a glass of Pinot Grigio, and I ordered sparkling water with lemon. The restaurant was full of people, couples, families, business associates conducting Friday evening networking under the guise of social dining. None of them had any idea that they were about to witness a family system disintegrate in real time. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, and I allowed her to hold it, and I felt the specific texture of her skin, which was soft in the way that skin becomes soft when it has been protected from physical labor for 6 decades, when it has been maintained with expensive lotions and sunscreen, and the kind of dermatological interventions that only become available to people with substantial discretionary income. I want to apologize, she said, for everything. For the way I treated you when you were young, for the things I said to you at the country club, for the years I spent insisting that you were incapable of achievement. I realize now that I was projecting my own fears onto you, that I was using you as a repository for my anxieties about competence and worth, and I want you to know that I am sorry, truly sorry. I would like to start over. I would like to actually get to know my daughter. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I looked at her face, at the specific configuration of her features, at the way her mouth was arranged in an expression of performed sincerity, and I noticed, with the kind of clinical precision that I had been developing for years, the exact moment when her confidence in this performance began to falter. Mother, I said quietly, I need to tell you something about the past 4 years. I need to tell you about what I have been doing while you believed I was simply existing as a restaurant server, incapable of anything beyond carrying trays and accepting tips. Her hand tensed in mine. Her eyes shifted slightly to the left, which was the physical tell that indicated anxiety was beginning to manifest at the physiological level. 4 years ago, I continued, I became aware that you were committing fraud against my grandfather's estate. I became aware that you were accessing his financial accounts without authorization, that you were forging his signatures on loan documents, that you were systematically stealing from him while he was in a skilled nursing facility undergoing chemotherapy. I became aware of this, and instead of confronting you, instead of going to the authorities, I began to document everything. I created a spreadsheet. I gathered evidence. I photographed every single piece of documentation. And I waited. My mother's hand had gone completely rigid. She attempted to withdraw it from the table, but I held her in place with a pressure that was firm but not aggressive. That was simply a statement of fact about the relative positions of power in our current configuration. I kept working at Marchetti's, I continued, because I wanted you to maintain your certainty about my incompetence. I wanted you to believe that I was exactly what you had always insisted I was, a person without capacity, without ambition, without the capability to understand or challenge you. I enrolled in law school and I did not tell you. I passed the bar examination and I did not tell you. I became a junior partner at Morrison and Clark and I did not tell you. And all of this time I was building a case against you. The Pinot Grigio arrived at the table. My mother's hand was still in mine, and her face had undergone a transformation that was almost fascinating to observe. The blood had not drained from it, because that was physiologically inaccurate and also a cliché, but instead her skin had taken on a quality of gray that suggested her body was processing information that contradicted her fundamental understanding of reality. On Monday, I said, I provided the district attorney's office with comprehensive documentation of 173 separate acts of financial fraud, identity theft, forgery, and embezzlement, totaling approximately $9,437,000. I provided them with bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals from a money market account established in 1998. I provided them with forged loan documents that you executed against my grandfather's home equity line of credit. I provided them with amendments to my grandfather's revocable living trust that you notarized through a notary who has confirmed she never notarized those documents. And I provided them with email correspondence between you and your accountant discussing the optimal way to execute this theft without triggering suspicious activity reports. My mother attempted to speak, but her mouth had gone dry, and the words that emerged were fragmented and incoherent. Catherine, you cannot, this is not. The cream-colored suit you wore to the courtroom, I said, cost $4,215. I photographed the receipt. That suit was purchased with money stolen from my grandfather's estate. The white roses you sent to my apartment on Sunday, which cost $195, were also purchased with stolen funds. The $75,000 you spent renovating the kitchen in your Pacific Palisades home last year, all of it stolen. Every luxury in your life for the past 4 years has been constructed on top of theft, on top of fraud, on top of crimes perpetrated against a man who trusted you absolutely and who died believing that you were an honest person worthy of that trust. I released her hand. I stood up from the table. I looked directly at her and I said, the district attorney will contact you within the next 48 hours. You will be arrested on 17 felony counts. You will face between 10 and 20 years of incarceration, depending on how you cooperate with the investigation. Your home will be seized as proceeds of crime. Your bank accounts will be frozen. Your attorney has already been contacted and is prepared to represent you. I suggest you contact her immediately and begin discussing your options for plea negotiation. I placed my napkin on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not display any emotional content that would have suggested I was experiencing satisfaction or triumph. I simply spoke the facts in the kind of clinical, detached tone that a person uses when they are reading a weather report or explaining the nutritional content of a food product. What, Catherine, please, my mother said, and her voice had collapsed into something small and desperate. Please, if you go forward with this, it will destroy our family. It will destroy everything. Your aunts, your cousins, people who love you, people who love me, I repeated, do not humiliate me in a courtroom to advance their own financial interests. People who love me do not spend 4 decades teaching me that invisibility is my only appropriate response to their criticism. People who love me do not celebrate my perceived incompetence while committing felonies against my grandfather's estate. The people who love me are the people who told me the truth, who believed in me even when you refused to see me, and who helped me build the case that will protect my grandfather's legacy and ensure that you face appropriate consequences for your crimes. I walked out of the restaurant at 7:53 in the evening. I did not look back. I did not allow my shoulders to shift or my gait to change. I walked directly to my car and I called Richard Chen and I said, she has been informed. The trap has been fully executed. The arrest warrants were issued at 6:37 in the morning on Friday, exactly 42 hours after my dinner with my mother. She was arrested at her home in Pacific Palisades at 7:23 in the morning, approximately 15 minutes after she returned from an early morning tennis lesson at the country club, where she had been a member for 18 years. The Los Angeles Police Department served her with the warrant, and she was handcuffed, and she was read her rights, and she was transported to the downtown jail for booking and processing. Within hours, my aunts began calling my phone. I did not answer. They left voicemails expressing shock, expressing denial, expressing the specific variety of panic that comes from understanding that the family mythology they had all participated in constructing had just collapsed into demonstrable criminality. My Aunt Patricia's message suggested that I must have made a terrible mistake and that I should immediately contact the prosecutor's office to withdraw the charges. My Aunt Melissa's message was more direct. She said, "Catherine, what you have done is unforgivable. You have destroyed your mother, and you will never be forgiven for this, and you will spend the rest of your life regretting this decision." The house in Pacific Palisades, which my mother had purchased for $2,800,000 in 2011, was seized by the federal government as proceeds of crime. The luxury vehicles in her garage, a Mercedes Benz, a Range Rover, a Tesla, were all seized and sold at federal auction. The jewelry in her safe deposit box was cataloged and liquidated. Within 2 weeks, the visible infrastructure of my mother's life had been completely dismantled. The grand jury indictment was unsealed on June 28th, and it was reported in the Los Angeles Times, in financial publications, and in several legal databases that track white-collar crime prosecutions. The article described my mother as a sophisticated financial criminal who exploited her elderly father's declining health to systematically steal millions from his estate, and it noted that the investigation had been initiated as a result of the victim's own daughter, who documented the crimes over 4 years and brought comprehensive evidence to law enforcement. My name was not included in the initial articles, but by the second article, published 3 days later, my identity had been revealed, and I was described as a criminal defense attorney who single handedly constructed a prosecution case of exceptional complexity. My mother's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea bargain approximately 2 weeks into the legal proceedings. She contacted Richard Chen and suggested that my mother would be willing to plead guilty to 8 of the 17 charges if the remaining charges would be dismissed and if the prosecution would recommend a sentence of 4 to 6 years rather than the full 10 to 20. Richard brought this offer to me, and I listened to his explanation of the legal implications, and I said, "I am not interested in negotiation. I am interested in truth." She committed 17 felonies. She should be prosecuted for 17 felonies. What the court chooses to do with that information is beyond my control. The trial began in October, approximately 4 months after my mother's arrest. I attended the first day of proceedings, dressed in a navy blazer over a white blouse, seated in the gallery behind the prosecution's table. My mother sat at the defense table, and her appearance had changed significantly. Her hair had lost its precise blonde arrangement and had reverted to a more natural gray. Her skin had taken on the specific pallor that comes from incarceration and stress. Her posture had collapsed into something smaller and more fragile than the version of her that had stood in a courtroom months earlier and insisted that I was just a waitress. The prosecution's case took 4 weeks to present. They presented the bank statements. They presented the forged documents. They presented the forensic handwriting analysis. They presented the emails between my mother and her accountant. They presented the testimony of the forensic accountants who had traced the flow of stolen funds through 3 separate shell companies and multiple bank accounts. And they presented me, Catherine Voss, attorney, executor of the estate, and the person who had documented every single crime with the kind of methodical precision that made the prosecution's case essentially unopposable. I testified for 2 days. I explained the spreadsheet I had created. I explained the methodology I had used to document the crimes. I explained why I had chosen to remain silent about my educational and professional progress while working at Marchetti's. I explained my grandfather's trust in me, and the specific nature of the crimes that had been perpetrated against that trust, and the decades of family mythology that had created the conditions under which I was capable of the kind of sustained documentation and strategic invisibility that had ultimately led to her prosecution. The verdict was delivered on December 2nd. My mother was found guilty on all 17 counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for February. But I did not wait for the sentencing. I did not need to observe the moment when the judge imposed a sentence of 14 years of incarceration. I had already received what I actually needed, not revenge, not triumph, but the restoration of accurate narrative, the reassertion of truth into a space where lies had been permitted to calcify into institutional fact, and the security that came from knowing that my grandfather's legacy had been protected, that his trust in me had been vindicated, and that the person who had spent 4 decades teaching me that I was worthless had been revealed to be substantially more worthless than she had ever suggested I was. I resigned from Morrison and Clark in January, and I accepted a position at a firm in San Francisco that specialized in complex estate litigation and the prosecution of financial crimes. I moved to a high-rise apartment on the 43rd floor of a building in Soma, and from my windows I could see the entire Bay Area, the specific configuration of the Golden Gate Bridge, the way the light hit the water during the late afternoon hours when the sun was beginning its descent toward the Pacific Ocean. I purchased a coffee maker, an espresso machine in brushed steel, capable of producing approximately 12 cups per day, and I would wake in the early morning and I would make myself a beverage, and I would stand at the window of my apartment, and I would observe the world continuing to exist, indifferent to my family's collapse, indifferent to my triumph, simply continuing in its own particular way. And I want to tell you 5 things that I learned through this process. 5 hard truths that I wish someone had told me when I was young. 5 understandings that would have saved me approximately 6 years of pain and invisibility and strategic compartmentalization of my own life. The first truth is this: your family does not get to define your worth. No matter how many times they tell you that you are incapable, no matter how many times they dismiss your accomplishments or minimize your potential, their words are simply noise generated by people who are terrified of your actual power. They tell you that you are small because they need you to be small. They tell you that you are worthless because your worth threatens their control. And the moment you understand that their assessment of you has nothing to do with objective reality and everything to do with their own psychological fragility, you are free. The second truth is this: silence is not the same as powerlessness. I spent 4 years wearing a restaurant uniform while I earned a law degree and built a prosecution case. I spent 4 years being invisible, and that invisibility was not weakness, it was strategy. It was the deliberate choice to allow people to underestimate me, to allow them to build walls of confidence that were built on their misperception of my reality. And when those walls fell, they fell completely, because they were constructed on a foundation of lies. The third truth is this: documentation is power. The moment you begin to record, not just in your mind, not in the quiet conversations you have with yourself, but in actual, physical, legal documentation, the moment you begin to gather evidence of the specific ways that people are harming you, you have transformed the relationship from something private and shame-based into something that can be submitted to authorities, to lawyers, to systems of justice. My spreadsheet was not just a record of crimes. It was a statement that I refused to allow my family to define the narrative about what had happened to me. The fourth truth is this: your peace is more valuable than their approval. I spent decades trying to earn my mother's respect, trying to do things that would convince her that I was worthy of her love, trying to construct a version of myself that would finally satisfy her impossible standards. And then I realized that her approval was never actually available to me, that it was not a thing I could earn through better behavior or higher achievement, because it was never actually about my behavior or achievement. It was about her need to maintain control, to position herself as the arbiter of worth, to keep me small enough that she could manage me. The moment I stopped trying to earn her approval and started protecting my own peace instead, I became invulnerable to her weapons. The fifth and final truth is this: consequences are not cruelty. I did not destroy my mother because I wanted to hurt her. I prosecuted my mother because she committed crimes, and those crimes needed to be brought to light. I allowed the legal system to do its job. I allowed truth to be established in a courtroom. I refused to protect her from the consequences of her own choices. And that was not revenge. That was accountability. That was the refusal to participate in the family mythology that had protected her from facing what she had actually done. That was the assertion that some people do not deserve to be protected from the consequences of their actions, and that protecting them actually enables them to continue harming others. Keep your boundaries strong. Guard your peace, and I will see you in the next.